What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 times that I wanted to rage quit. You see, every once in a while, someone will ask me if I would continue to play games in the way that I do if I, didn't have to review them. Basically, is there a point at which I would stop if something was too annoying or just kind of more effort than I really felt like putting in, that kind of thing? And the general answer to that is, of course, yes. Reviewing games and covering them is ultimately my job, and while, luckily, because I am self-employed, I get to focus on the things I actually want to do, which helps alleviate some of that to begin with. There are certainly times I'll be playing a game, get to a point where I realize that, if I wasn't doing this for a living, this is probably just where I would have stopped. And that's honestly pretty good information, because then I can add, at the very least, that sort of general sentiment to the review itself, and of course give people that perspective. And that's all well and good, but you see, then there are some games. Some games fill me with a righteous anger, a fury that inspires me to cleave in twain files from storage space. That is to say, they make me want to uninstall them. Now, in reality, what happens is I get up and I walk away for a little bit before coming back to it another time. Usually a little bit later, or after I just take like the equivalent of a lunch break or something. Because, again, it is my job and, has to get done at some point, but today, obviously, I wanted to talk about some moments that I found particularly annoying to the point of me just wanting to stop playing. Some from games that I love, others more neutral, of course, but oftentimes what genuinely really annoys me is boss fights that I have to just slam my head against for hours on end. Tends to be a recurring theme, and as a result is usually where I lose my patience more than anything else. But even then, not always, which we'll get into. But with that stuff said, let's actually get into this and talk about it a bit. So, the first one I wanted to mention is actually from one of my favorite games of all time, which is Final Fantasy XII. And not just recently, I did actually review it this year, which is the Zodiac Age version, which I had not played previously, but always wanted to because I loved Final Fantasy XII and playing it with my dad as a teenager. But in thinking about this list, it occurs to me that there was a moment when I played this game originally, more than 15 years ago, that made me so angry I remember it now here in 2025 for the sake of this video, which is obviously a good place to start. Because you see, it has to do with the original version of Yasmat, the sort of super boss, or at least one of the super bosses, hidden behind some extra content and stuff. Now, Yasmat in its original form was a true monster. In the Zodiac Age, they've actually made this boss significantly easier. I talked about it at length in that Zodiac Age review. But the original was honestly ridiculous. It was way too much. In fact, I believe the speedrun version of that fight was still an hour long. Now, there's plenty of things that contribute to this. The monster's absolutely gigantic health pool. Multiple abilities that can kill you outright. They literally have a % chance of just killing you. Obviously a massive attack, etc. Now, the other thing is, this fight also has a bunch of phases to it, despite being more of a marathon than a sprint. And when Yasmat starts to get low on HP, one thing that he'll do, I believe it's just once at the very end of the fight, is he will cast Reflect not on himself, but your party. Now, all the way back, and I think it was 2010, I did not know about this because online guides and stuff were just starting to become a thing back then, and I learned this the hard way because another thing that was very common in the original version of Final Fantasy XII was to set up your entire party to use a spell called Renew, which basically just full healed your HP. And you might already see where I'm going with this because, as I learned momentarily after this, using Renew is not ideal. You actually want to use the heal just below that, which heals a set amount. And the reason for this is that after several hours of fighting Yasmat, he cast Reflect when he hit that stage. And before I even knew what happened, I cast Renew on myself, only for it to be reflected back onto Yasmat and fully restore his roughly 40 million HP of damage I had already done to him. And naturally, I was furious. I turned off the game, got up, walked outside, and honestly took an hour-long walk. I was very, very upset. And I eventually came back and, sat down and beat him again properly, armed with this new knowledge and very painful lesson, but definitely a core memory. For our second entry, I want to get something much more recent. This happened basically a couple days ago. Although I do have to mention some slight spoilers here for Horizon Forbidden West. I'm basically going to show you who the last boss is, So if you don't want to see that, or for whatever reason, go ahead and skip past this part. But as many people know, as I've mentioned it, I am currently in the process of finishing up Horizon Forbidden West. And while for the most part it's been a long but enjoyable experience, there was a sort of somewhat random thing that genuinely was infuriating right at the end, which is the last boss, sort of. But it's not really the last boss that got annoying to me, but rather the arena that the last boss is in. You see, an interesting thing about the Horizon games is that while you have to battle all these machines and everything, the vast majority of the time, these fights take place in what I consider kind of outdoor arenas. They are basically the sites where the machines spawn in, and there's all sorts of things in that environment to add dynamic elements to those combat situations. That usually includes most of the boss fights, and as a result of this, you can often use terrain to your advantage, and in many cases, there's often points on the battlefield where you are effectively immune to what the machines can do to you as a way to cheese past most of the fights. Now, on rare occasion, it does happen sometimes, you are put into an arena that has no such spot, and you are forced to actually fight one-on-one with usually some form of gigantic machine. Now, the thing about all of those fights, but the last boss especially, is that the ground isn't exactly flat, obviously, and there's debris and things, and the problem is our protagonist Aloy really likes to get stuck on that stuff, especially when you're focused more on what the boss is doing and not necessarily the tiny ledge that Aloy decides she can't climb up despite clambering up broken ruins every other day. And frankly, it's really annoying, but there was no place I had more of an issue with this than the very last boss fight. The arena, for starters, is like a weird oblong oval, which makes it very hard to sort of circle strafe around anyway, but what makes it much worse is that it's not an actually flat arena. There are these little stairs kind of circling it, and something I noticed is that in certain sections, these stairs will actually prevent you from just walking up. You'll basically kind of get stuck and sort of slide up and next to them, and that's in addition to the weird shape of the arena, and the fact that there are also bits of destroyable cover around as well that the boss will smash through. Now, I was playing this for my first run on Ultra Hard. The long and short of it basically means that this boss has a pretty sizable amount of health, and also most of its attacks can just straight up one-shot you. Now, while the moveset here is not so difficult as to be unavoidable or anything, what makes that moves really hard to avoid actually is constantly getting caught on terrain. And I am not even exaggerating when I say that I died to this boss probably 50 or 60 times because I kept getting caught on stairs, caught on cover, caught on invisible walls on the outside of the arena. And by the end of it, it honestly felt more like I was battling the terrain than I was the boss, which felt ridiculous because it's mostly a flat, empty room, or is supposed to be. Now, luckily, the attempts here are pretty quick because of the one-shots, so it's not like this took an especially long time. The entire process, split across 2 days, was maybe 3 hours. But after the first hour, on the first day, I was starting to get annoyed with it, to the point where I was like, I've had enough for today. Got up, picked it back up the next day, had to do it for another 2 hours before I finally was able to get it sorted out. And I was just not having a good time there, which is obviously what it's doing on this list. Third up, we've got another more recent one from Wu Chang Fallen Feathers. A pretty good Souls-like, a little by the books. Some things I don't like about it that will somewhat come up in the form of how things like parry and block are tied to weapon skills rather than things you can just innately do. It's called disciplines in the game, though. You have to equip them, and then the weapon you're using has to be able to equip them in order to actually do things like parry or block. Now, I've played a fair few Souls-likes, so they're not like a new thing to me or anything, but every once in a while I will encounter a boss within them that is just really, really challenging to me, specifically for one reason or another. And in this case, it's the game's first major boss, Commander Honglan. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments. But she is the boss at the end of what, could more or less be considered Act 1. And she represents a massive difficulty spike that, thanks to a little bit of problem with things like conveyance, that is to say the way the game gives you information and tutorializes you, makes this fight a bit of a hard check for people, which is why I would imagine even 3 weeks on, only about 50% of people have gotten past this boss, despite it being a relatively early boss. You see, this is the encounter that they try to teach you about things like your sword counter or your weapon parry, but as I've already mentioned, depending on your build, you might not actually be ready to do that, because you might be using a build that just literally doesn't have it as an option. And the good news there is you can just freely respec, so it's not exactly the end of the world. You can just go swap it out and learn a different moveset, but already a little bit of trouble with conveyance. The other thing, though, is that something this will also tell you is that you can only parry weapon attacks. Things like limbs, fist attacks, kicks, that kind of thing. It's not going to work. And guess what this boss loves to throw in? At seemingly random intervals, a bunch of kicks and punches into her combos that are extremely fast, and thanks to the fact that she's roughly the size of your character, also really hard to see telegraphed. Until you're already being hit, you can't counter them. And then you top that with the fact that she is really, really good at denying you distance. She has several long-range attacks designed to close distance between you and her, which makes it extremely difficult to heal. And then on top of that, you add the game's madness mechanic, which can actually see you taking more damage while you're trying to learn her moveset and everything, and you've got yourself a rage-inducing boss. I had more trouble fighting this specific boss fight than I did any other part of the game. Even the in-game bosses were much, much easier. I was stuck on this fight for hours, and it was once again a situation where I just kind of had to give up and come back the next day with fresh eyes, so to speak, to try again, because it was brutal. And it was definitely one of those moments where if I was not playing this for a review, I probably just would have stopped there rather than beat my head against this wall. And unfortunately, bosses like this specifically tend to deny me the satisfaction that comes with Souls-likes, that is to say, overcoming a challenge. I get that sometimes. In fact, there is a similar, kind of theoretically anyway, boss that I'm not going to mention because it is a bit of a big spoiler. That was honestly also really, really difficult, but the curve there felt much more fair, and I was able to respond and learn to the moves and everything. And overcoming that boss, which took just as long as this one, felt really rewarding because I had mastered the mechanics and the moveset. But bosses like Honglan here, who just don't seem fair, really kind of deny me that feeling, to the point where when those fights are over, I'm just happy that they're over rather than overjoyed that I overcame some hurdle, which can certainly be frustrating. Now, second from last here, I wanted to mention one that was a little bit different, and this is Dragon's Dogma 2. You see, up to this point, I've mostly mentioned boss fights, but Dragon's Dogma 2 made me want to rage quit because of its very, very lackluster back half of its story. Now, Dragon's Dogma 2 to me was a bit of a disappointment. Having come from the first game, I was hoping they had fixed a lot of that stuff, really kind of leaned in and expanded and told the story they wanted to tell, and for the first part of the game, they seemingly did that. So imagine my surprise when I get to the second part of the game, that is to say the desert area, only to find out that the rest of the game is actually quite short because it's almost nonsensical at that point, because it's moving so fast, because they clearly have to wrap things up, and none of it just adds up at all. It was an incredibly disappointing story, and given that one of the first game's big problems was that it was a really cool story that just wasn't told very well, they don't really have that excuse for the second game, because again, it actually starts off really good, and then just falls off a cliff as soon as you step into the desert area. You meet a bunch of characters who are on screen for 2 seconds, say basically nothing, before potentially being murdered in bizarre side quests like trying to keep the Queen of the Cat People alive from some assassin, but that mission was extremely confusing and extraordinarily easy to fail. And it was really just a combination of those factors that kind of just made me want to put the game down and walk away from it. And ironically, because I was so close to the end of the game, obviously I was going to finish it, but I also had to go through New Game Plus and stuff so I could check all of that out for the review and of course the other endings and whatnot. But seeing all of that coalesce on the back half of that game, I was just over it. Having seen this game repeat basically some of the biggest mistakes from the first game after claiming it wasn't going to do that, which ultimately made the game feel more honestly, kind of like a remaster than a proper sequel, and I was just honestly kind of angry about how much they dropped the ball there, to the point that I really just didn't want to play it anymore, despite obviously having needed to get the review done and everything. Very, very frustrating one in that case. Last but not least, though, just one game I haven't talked about in quite some time, at least at length, or this specific moment anyway, which is Tyranny. Tyranny is the lesser-known CRPG from Obsidian Entertainment, but if you're watching my channel regularly, you likely know that already, and you may even have heard me mention this before, but you see, Tyranny, much like Pillars of Eternity, has a difficulty called Path of the Damned, the highest one. There is an achievement for beating the game on that, which obviously I have done. And yet, a really odd thing about Path of the Damned for Tyranny is that, in my opinion, by far and away, and it is not even close by a country mile, the most difficult encounter of that entire experience is the boss fights at the end of the first act. You see, for the most part, if you understand the game's mechanics, especially how the magic system works and how to make it useful for you and, the best magic to use to defend yourself, that kind of thing, you should be okay on Path of the Damned. None of the fights are so complicated as to be impossible or anything. And yet, fighting the last group at the end of Act 1 as you seek to ascend a spire was nightmarishly difficult. So much so that to this day, I am not exactly sure how I managed it. I limped out of that fight with one of the side characters, Landry, being the only person left alive. He's kind of your magic user. And he had like 5 HP. The dice kind of just finally rolled my way, I guess. Now, the problem with this fight, the thing that makes it so difficult, is that you have very limited access to magic at this point, and while a lot of the fights before this are small enough that, you can just take advantage of a couple things and be okay. This fight, however, you are outnumbered to the tune of like double. They're fast, they hit extremely hard, and you just don't have the magic to deal with them, like it is just not available to you. And so the best I could ever really manage was trying to use the big tables in the room to force a little bit of distance between me and some enemies, and obviously fight back in the meantime, but just between the numbers, the damage they were dealing, it was extraordinarily difficult just to hold my own. And that's frustrating enough, but the part of this that really put it over the edge for me was just how kind of lacking in any strategy there was for this. And to kind of, add insult to injury afterwards, the rest of the game's probably going to be a breeze for you from here. I'm not kidding when I say this is probably the hardest fight in the game, in my opinion. And that's mostly because you start getting access to more and more magic, and if you know where it is and how to make use of it, the rest of the fights are very easy in comparison. And while I actually finished this one about a year or so before I started doing YouTube full-time, it is burned into my psyche as genuinely one of the more difficult boss fights I've had to deal with, and it still makes me furious, which is obviously what it's doing on this list. But I do believe that is pretty much going to wrap up everything I've had to say on this one, just kind of recalling sometimes that, at least temporarily, the video games won. So if you enjoyed any of that, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know if there's any moments you've decided to just rage quit or any other funny story like that you want to mention, I suppose. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.